What's up, guys? Alexander here with datepsychology.com. Haven't made a video in a little bit longer than I would have liked, but I wanted to get back and answer the questions that you had all asked of me in the last community post. So at the moment, I just finished a new article on the website, conducted a little survey as well. I'm going to post that up here and have a look at this article. It's pretty long, but I think you guys will like it. If you don't want to read a long article, the next video that I make will probably be a summary on this article, and hopefully I can get it out a little bit more quickly. So that said, let's go ahead and look at these questions. I've tried to answer all of them, and I've kind of grouped them by category. Some of the questions people asked were similar, so some personal questions, some research questions, and also some opinions like, hey, what do you think about this thing? So I kind of grouped them by those in order. Let's go ahead and go through and see what these are. So first question, what will your thesis be on? Right now, I'm basically in a limbo because I'm about to move. So I'm probably going to have to switch programs as well. I think what my new advisor will probably be, who I'm looking at for a new advisor, will be something related to hormonal birth control and cognitive processes in that sense. A lot of what you have to pick for a thesis is kind of predetermined by what researchers are already doing in your university. So kind of limited in what I can do. Kind of depends on what's available there. So in any case, time will tell. It probably won't be until summer of the year coming up next year. So in the moment, part of the reason why I have free time to do this is because, classes are done. So I'm just kind of hanging out and waiting to finish that. Let's see. So what do you want to do after you graduate? Probably what I'll continue to do is stay in school. I'll try to either get into a PhD program or perhaps even another master's program. That was kind of why I went back to school in the first place, was just because I like the environment. I like to study and keep learning. And so, of course, being in an academic environment, especially a research-oriented program, kind of facilitates that. And of course, I want to keep doing this channel and keep with the social media stuff, keep writing the articles, and keep researching all of the things that I enjoy on a personal basis and kind of making it available to you guys, break it down in a way that's easy for everyone to kind of digest and understand. Let's see. Third question here. So what motivated you to study psychology? So fun story. When I actually first entered a 4-year university, I was studying anthropology because I wanted to study people. And I thought, oh, well, anthropology, the study of humans, that makes sense. So I went into that and I thought it was cool. And also I liked the idea that it would let me travel. I thought, if I ever get into an anthropology PhD program, then I'll be able to travel around the world. Basically, you're studying a group of people doing an ethnography. And so ideally, you get a research position and they pay you to live overseas someplace. So what actually happened, I transferred schools. And when I did that, there was no anthropology program, but there was a psychology program. And so I thought, this is the closest thing. I guess I'll do it, although I'm not really thrilled about it. Because I had always thought of psychology as particularly studies of mental health and disorders, and that never really interested me, including up to this day. The study of kind of disorders, mental illness doesn't do a lot for me. I wanted to study like normal people. One of the first classes that I took was a social psychology course. And it just blew me away because it was all the study of like normal people, normal behavior, why people do this and why people do that. And it was such a good course. It was so well put together. It was actually very difficult as well. The amount of memorization and the things that we had to go over, kind of rigorous for an undergrad introductory course as far as those are concerned. And I was really impressed by psychology as a field. I thought, there's a whole aspect to this that isn't therapy, that isn't studying people with mental disorders and that sort of thing, but that's studying normal behavior and normal behavior, normal people who don't have clinical diagnoses and that sort of thing. And I thought, wow, this really kind of helps you understand people better, even better than anthropology does, because anthropology, you're studying humans through a cultural lens, often in a foreign context. And to what extent does that really help you understand individual behavior and that sort of thing? Perhaps even less. And then in grad school, this is, kind of a personality psychology program. And I thought, this even more so is focused on those specific things that interest me. And that kind of reignited a passion there, especially with focus on dating and that sort of thing. So Question 4, are you a professional academic? No, just a student. I'm a grad student right now. So maybe one day, but at the moment, professional academic, no. Very much student and a hobby. I put a lot of effort into it, but so perhaps in the future, if I continue down this path, I will be one day. Are you a dating coach? Will you become one? Probably not, because although people have tended to interpret what I talk about, the channel and that, especially at the beginning, like, is this kind of like a dating coach? What's going on here? It's not really what I do. I don't have a lot of good advice. In fact, a lot of the time, the material that I cover, it's going to be bringing bad news as much as good news. So typically, no, not what I do. Probably not something that I'm going to ever do. It's not something I'm especially interested in. But of course, people, since I have started social media accounts and YouTube, people ask me for dating advice often. And I'm happy to, if someone asks, like, hey, can you give me advice? I'll give you advice. But certainly not something that I would do professionally or charge money for or anything like that. So let's see. When did you begin studying dating psychology? Why do you study dating psychology? So this is something that I had an interest in even as an undergrad, but in none of the programs has there been a specific track that really focuses on that. Any study of attraction and dating, a lot of it's going to be within personality psychology. So I think probably a lot of exposure to it was recently in grad school. Aside from that, it's not really a single field in psychology. Some of what we see comes from evolutionary psychology, but I think most of it actually comes from personality psychology. And so if you study anything related to personality on a personality track and those kinds of tracks, courses, a lot of it will end up overlapping with dating decisions, with the kind of people you pair off with. And usually it's not exploring that from an evolutionary perspective, but now there's, evolutionary psychology is very much focused on dating and mating. So that's something that I've looked a lot more into recently, which is also very interesting and gives a very different kind of unique approach to understanding dating behavior and that sort of thing. So when did I start studying it specifically? Probably, well, like I said, as an undergrad, always as a hobby, and then more often recently in grad school as well. Few years, more than a few years probably at this point. Why did you start the website and social media? So I began the website kind of as a way to keep research and skills sharp, and also in part to kind of brush up on that focus on kind of dating psychology specifically, because that is something that I would like to go into more in the future. If I go into a PhD program, for example, then I'll have a lot more leeway on what kind of topics I can study. I have a lot more decision in that, and then I could really focus much more specifically on dating behavior, on mate selection and that sort of thing. So let's see, hobbies other than lifting and research. No, there's none. That's all that I do at the moment is this, and then I go to the gym. It's very one-dimensional personality here at the moment. So, and what will you do after you graduate? Like I said, probably I will continue to study and continue to run the website and make the videos. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, having a lot of fun talking to people online about all of these topics, meeting a lot of really interesting people online, a lot of academics, a lot of other students and that sort of thing. Definitely want to stay in an academic environment. That's kind of the main goal, is to kind of continue on this path that I'm on now. So let's see. Wrapping up kind of the personal questions. I think I got probably most of them there, fast ones. We can look at some of these studies. Someone asked, heritability. Are there exceptions to the 50-0-50 rule? So the 50-0-50 rule in psychology, kind of a rough estimate across behavioral and personality psychology that about half of behavior and personality is genetic in origin, or you should say maybe half is explained by heritability, which is an estimate of genetic contribution. So, and then the 0 would be shared environment, which is with the home environment. And the remaining 50% is the non-shared environment, the environment out in the world, the experiences that you would have independently from your sibling, basically, from whom heritability estimates are derived. So are there exceptions? When I started looking up papers to try and answer this question, I'm sure there's many. I'm sure there's many, and there's so many very, very specific niche things that are researched in psychology that nothing actually stood out to me. especially coming from personality psychology, from, kind of where this rule is derived from, which is basically, that as a rough estimate, it's always going to be about half. Of course, it's not literally always going to be about half. That's, like I said, it's kind of a rule of thumb. So I thought, what could be an example of something that is purely environmental? And I got to say, it's very difficult to find anything that is researched with this kind of methodology that finds something is purely environmental. And this is something I was taught in one of my graduate courses relatively recently, which was person-environment interaction. They said, have you guys heard about nature and nurture? Basically, it's not nature and nurture. There's no such debate at this point. It's always person and environment interaction, right? So it's never, is it genes or is it environment? It's always, how much do genes contribute? How much does environment contribute? And then looking at the both, how do they interact with one another? So looking this up, like I said, I was originally looking for studies that perhaps would indicate very low heritability. The first example is a study that I actually referenced and discussed in the recent article on my website, which is about facial attractiveness. And I was surprised at this, how low it was, that most of the variance in facial attractiveness is actually explained by environment. So there's about 25 point, a heritability of 0.22 for facial attractiveness. And what does that mean? That the faces we find attractive may be influenced more by non-shared environment than by perceptions that we inherit, right? Rather than by our own genes. Now, this doesn't mean that facial attractiveness would be subjective or even necessarily that culture specific, because we still actually see relatively large correlations on what faces people agree on, just that the basis for it is perhaps not genetic. The low heritability estimates there, probably going to be the lowest that I go over here. But to look at some other large ones and some heritability estimates in commonly researched things and topics that I talk about often. So major depression, for example, about 28 to 44% heritability. Dark triad traits, much higher, 50 to 70. So here, if a lot of these exceptions to the 50-0-50 rule are actually going to be in the other direction. We're going to see more heritability than 50% and not less. So some of these, especially, personality traits are going to have higher rather than lower heritability. Dark triad, as high as 70%. And I think that varies by the specific facets of the dark triad traits as well. I think narcissism is actually the high one on that gets closer to 70%. SDO, this is social dominance orientation, and this is a belief in kind of like social dominance, might makes right, and then also beliefs related to egalitarianism, high egalitarianism beliefs versus low. And here we see 37% for the dominance facet of the SDO scale and about 24% for the egalitarianism scale. So political beliefs, because that's basically kind of what this overlaps with. It's used to measure political beliefs in some cases. Pretty high heritability. They also follow the 50-0-50 rule. So the second slide on this, we continue. Authoritarianism. A lot of research on the heritability of authoritarianism. Bob Altemeyer, who devised the authoritarianism scale, he found this back in the 80s, 50 to 70% heritability. And this even has higher heritability from fathers to sons. I think it was as high as 90 in that case. So authoritarians come from authoritarian parents, high heritability. Political belief in general. And this was looking at both political affiliations, specifically with political parties, and also political ideology, general left and right. This study referenced here by Hatemi and colleagues in 2014, really big study across many cultures. Heritability estimates for political beliefs about 30 to 60%. So a little bit lower, a little bit higher than the 50-0-50 rule in some cases, but still we see a very large contribution of genetics to what way people tend to lean politically. Anxiety disorders, okay, about half. Cluster B personality disorders. So what are those? Cluster B personality disorders are the antisocial type personality disorders, right? So antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder. These actually have pretty high heritability here, right? So antisocial, about 70%, 69%. BPD, borderline, 67%. Narcissistic, 71%. So actually similar to what we see with subclinical or trait narcissism in the dark triad, which was also about 70%. Again, we see as far as clinical narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, 71%, very similar heritability. And histrionic personality disorder, 63%. So these kind of antisocial behaviors and traits, especially high level diagnosed here, relatively high heritability. So sociosexual behavior, what is that? The willingness to have sex with many partners, right? 53%, so pretty close to the 50 in the 50-0-50 rule. Beliefs, actually much lower. So if you ask people about, is it okay to be promiscuous? Is it okay to have sex with many people? Then actually the heritability for that is about half. So the beliefs that we have versus our own sociosexual behavior have different heritability estimates, right? You might not want to be very promiscuous, but you might not really care if other people are, right? It might not be as genetic if you do care. That might be something that is more influenced by environment. Sexual coercion, which has some relationship with sociosexual behavior, about 20 to 25%, right? So, kind of what it sounds like, aggressive sexual behavior there. Addictions, okay, addictions have pretty high heritability, but this varies a lot depending on the addiction. So in the paper referenced here, it covered the heritability of a bunch of different addictions: nicotine, cocaine, gambling. I think it talked about marijuana as well. If these are behavioral addictions or physical addictions is kind of another question. But for all of these addictive and compulsive behaviors, we do see heritability, right? In some as low as 25%, and others as high as 70%. Things like addiction, let's move on to the next slide, and this is also an example, and obesity, right? So 40 to 70%. So heritability of obesity is kind of high as well. This is interesting because when we talk about things like addiction in popular culture, there's a lot of debate about, is this a medical condition? Should we treat this as like a vice, like a fault in your character? Should we treat this as a choice? Does the very high heritability of addiction mean that it's not really a choice? To some extent, it probably does, but at the same time, the way that we perceive and we think about the world is in the context of what is essentially choice, right? If it's an illusion or not, it's kind of how we interact with and perceive the world, that we make decisions and we're responsible for those decisions, and the outcomes are derived from those decisions. Now, there's certainly a question that's outside of psychology, the scope of psychology, which is how much do we actually have control over our own decisions? The heritability of behaviors and outcomes could indicate that perhaps we don't have that total absolute control. We don't have that kind of radical free will in that sense. Certainly for many people this will be controversial, especially people coming from fitness spaces, from motivational type spaces, because you pretty much have to believe that you have a lot of control over your own life if you're going to take steps to improve it and change it. But at the same time, the heritability of these things kind of indicates at the very least that we don't all begin on an equal footing, right? That some people are going to have things a lot easier and some a lot more difficult. So as far as the 50-0-50 rule, what behavior or personality traits actually have zero? Well, the zero in the 50-0-50 rule, for one, really, really stable. That actually falls at zero across most of these estimates, which is kind of controversial. And there's a researcher, primarily an intelligence researcher. His name is Satoshi Kanazawa. He's a very controversial fellow because of his research on intelligence and race and that sort of thing, if you would like to look him up. But he's written articles that basically say parenting has no effect on child outcomes because of the zero in the 50-0-50 rule. Regardless of how children are raised at home, we actually see them have very, very similar outcomes, and those outcomes are much better predicted by their genetics. And so this zero in the 50-0-50, as far as that, that zero is pretty stable. But as I mentioned at the beginning, what is solely environment out there? Probably nothing big. None of these big personality traits or measurements or things that we talk about often in the videos and the research that I cover at least, none of those seem to be solely environment. The largest thing I found almost by accident writing the most recent article, which was that low heritability for facial attractiveness, right? And if you get into very specific things like that, you might end up finding a lot of things that have much lower heritability estimates. But personality traits, like I have up here, the big 5 personality, the largest kind of personality scale or metric used, 40 to 60% across all of these traits. Pretty stable. Your personality is pretty genetic, you know. And if you look at things like height, for example, which can have a heritability estimate from about 70 to 0.90, you're seeing that height is about as genetic as a lot of behavior. Something to consider when we put it into context and interpret these personality traits, that they're just as genetic as many of the physical things that we think about ourselves as basically unchangeable. Moving on now to the next question. So sure, this one was from Stardust from Thinking Ape. Female in-group preferences. Can you do a review of female in-group preferences? So surprisingly, I spent some time looking at this. I didn't find a whole lot of research on this topic, but the best experiment that I found, the best research on this, was a paper from 2004. Rudman and Goodman ran 4 different experiments and designed specifically to address this question about female in-group preferences. Women have stronger in-group preferences, okay? So women prefer other women. They view other women more positively in general, in most cases. They prefer their mothers over their fathers and typically have more negative attitudes toward men, particularly about violence. They view men as more violent than they do women. So additionally, what they found here was a relationship between in-group preference in women and self-esteem. So higher self-esteem in women predicted higher in-group preferences. Women that had lower in-group preferences felt lower self-esteem. How can we interpret that? Well, it didn't seem to be the case for men, okay? So men can feel badly about other men as a group, basically, and still feel pretty good about themselves. Women, perhaps less the case. If women don't feel good about other women, if they don't feel good about women in general, that may be something that kind of tanks their own self-esteem. So self-esteem may actually have a unique role for women specifically in facilitating this in-group preference, right? To feel good about themselves, they need to feel good about women in general. Men perhaps can be more critical of other men or men as a group without feeling as bad about other men. And perhaps that's why something like, if I'm just speculating here now at this point, this is certainly not based in the research, perhaps it's why something like feminism can appeal to so many men, but there's much fewer women that would be called, perhaps you've heard the term like pick-me's, right? So women kind of that take the side of men, much fewer, but men that take the side of women, much more common. Keep in mind, as far as this female in-group preference, go on to the next slide here. Men also tend to prefer women more across many measures. If you look at Crisis et al. In 2017, so the women are wonderful effect, right? That women tend to be preferred both by women and by men. Women tend to be viewed positively in most cases. Not always the case. There are certain traits where women and men view men better, right? And one of those, if we look at Kalansky and colleagues here, and Banerjee and Greenwald as well, was that women view men as higher status. They see male authorities as more positively. Typically, men will be viewed as more competent by both men and women as well. So there are certain specific domains or areas where men may be viewed more positively. But in general, what we see is this women are wonderful effect, where women are perceived more positively by women and by men as well. Something else, Thomas and colleagues here did a study. They found that women who had lower in-group bias were more likely to have kind of higher psychopathology, specifically paranoia, which I think is perhaps consistent with the previous research that showed the relationship between self-esteem and in-group bias. Women that are more paranoid, that have perhaps more hesitation around other women, lower mental health. So we see kind of a mental health link in women and in-group bias that kind of may be driving that in-group bias. It may be, cognitively or mentally healthy for women to have that in ways that it is not for men. As far as that goes, I didn't find a lot else on in-group preferences specifically. We see that it is certainly a thing. I don't even think there's mixed results on that. I think it's something that is consistently observed, but much more detail on that. I'm not sure if there's a lot else out there. Let's see, next question here. So this was about the relationships between self-esteem, narcissism, mental health, and sexual market value or dating market value. Basically, how is narcissism related to self-esteem? Do narcissists have better relationships? It was asked in the question, if I recall, Jordan Peterson said that self-esteem, education was bad. I'm not entirely sure. I don't have that reference from Jordan Peterson, so I don't know exactly what he was saying, but just to kind of get an idea. So here's a study by Tracy in 2009, and this methodology tried to tease out what was essentially the difference between narcissism and self-esteem. And they broke this down into narcissistic self-aggrandizement and self-esteem, because some psychometrics, right, some tests may measure narcissism, they may measure self-esteem, they may not distinguish between the two very well, and that could perhaps inflate the positive associations with narcissism, which is something I think we see occasionally in dark triad research. We see, for example, people that score higher in trait narcissism tend to be perceived as like better well-groomed and that sort of thing. So certainly it would make sense that people who are narcissistic would perhaps take care of their appearance more, but at the same time, is that really due to narcissism, or is that due to a positive effect of higher self-esteem that narcissists may have? Does narcissism give people greater self-esteem is certainly a question here. So trying to tease those two out, they found associations with narcissism that don't occur with self-esteem. And I think this is also fairly consistent with outcomes that we see as far as research on relationship outcomes and clinical narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissism predicted deviant behavior, right? Crime, aggression. This was over a 5-year span. So people are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior, kind of what you would expect, since narcissism is one of the cluster B antisocial personality disorders. So narcissism predicted poor relationship function, and they had something like 52 different measures of poor relationship function, and most of those it had a negative relationship with differing effect sizes. Some were pretty low, some were higher, some were less than 0.1, some were as high as 0.5. So they varied on these outcomes, but one of the large ones, if I recall correctly, was aggression. So they're more likely to be aggressive with their partners. Narcissism predicted dissociation, and hubristic pride, which was kind of a facet of narcissism specifically that they measured, predicted social withdrawal and anxiety. I thought that was kind of interesting, because sometimes you will interact with people and they're kind of like shut-ins, and you'll wonder like, this is kind of someone who's not really excelling very well at life, but at the same time they think they're really like the shit. They're really arrogant and they think they just know everything. And it's kind of like, how are those two things reconciled? How can you be kind of like performing poorly in life and at the same time still have this great deal of like pride, like you are so right? Well, perhaps they're related through narcissism in that case. Not specifically related to relationships, at least in that example, but of course in this paper they are. And so these are all things that are going to impair relationships for the most part. A big one that it predicted, narcissism, lower relationship satisfaction. On the flip side, all of their self-esteem measures predicted positively these traits. So self-esteem, higher relationship satisfaction; narcissism, lower relationship satisfaction. Important then that they were able to tease out narcissism versus self-esteem. As I mentioned, they had a measure, a sub-facet of narcissism, hubristic pride. They had a few others. The same for self-esteem. They had an aspirational pride, I think it was. It was kind of like a positive measure of pride. And that also predicted positive traits differently than the negative pride measures. So it seems like these things could be easily confused, right? Narcissism and self-esteem could be easily confused. But if we're able to tease the two out, we see that they do predict very different relationship outcomes. I mentioned narcissistic personality disorder, how that predicts poorer relationship outcomes. Additionally, narcissism subclinical narcissism is a part of the dark triad, also predicts poor relationship outcomes. Much is said on the dark triad and its relationship to attractiveness, right? So people who score higher in DT traits often get rated as more attractive, both in kind of naturalistic experiment type settings, like in speed date settings, they're more likely to get picked. And even when you rate their pictures, so there seems to be a relationship between attractiveness, but when we look at actual relationship outcomes, narcissism, be it in the dark triad or in this, they tend to be poor for those individuals, right? Because, you know, we consider it a personality disorder or a personality problem in some sense, not without reason. If it was primarily predicting positive things, I don't think it would be considered that. But since it does predict poor outcomes for most of these things, something to consider. Perhaps it has a role that, and that is why it has persisted in humans in perhaps short-term mating, right? It provides some sort of short-term advantage, like other antisocial behaviors and traits, but as far as for relationships and long-term, perhaps much less. Let's see the next slide here. So just a mention on the previous slide as well. Narcissism predicted poorer attachment styles, right? So both anxious and avoidant attachment styles. Those are going to be problems for relationship formation as well. Mentioned here, dark triads. So we're looking at narcissism in this case as a dark triad facet. They, in this study by Boraz, Leon, and Rantala, they had a mate value scale. Now this is a self-rating of mate value. So as far as do other people really rate someone higher, questionable. But of course, people who score high in narcissism rate themselves as better mates, probably what you would expect from a narcissist, even if it is not true. They have more sexual partners, as previously mentioned. So that could be an indication that narcissism is associated with higher mate value. Certainly one of the measures of mate value commonly assumed, at least in the research, is that higher mates, you know, or people with higher mate value are going to have more partners, right? This assumption, I think it's generally good, but it's not something that we shouldn't question as well, because you also have to ask yourself, does higher promiscuity mean that your mate value is higher? You know, this could even be different for men and women. For example, a study by Rhodes found that more attractive women, the most attractive women, the women rated highest, don't have a lot of partners. It's kind of the mid women that have more partners. Why might that be? Well, they may need to have sex earlier in order to kind of secure a mate. They may have less mate choice. They may need to kind of get out there and play the field more. They may have less ability to retain a mate than a more attractive partner. The relationship for men was different, okay? The most attractive men typically have the most partners. Kind of what you would expect from men, given the higher libido of men, given the higher sociosexuality of men, the higher willingness of men to have sex with many partners. In a previous video, we went over, for example, the Clark and Hatson research, the original research, and the replication, where most men, if they're approached by a random beautiful woman who just says, hey, do you want to have sex? They will actually agree. Almost no women will. Most men will. So it kind of makes sense that perhaps the most attractive men take advantage of the fact that they can have sex with a lot of partners, and they do. So partner count may actually measure mate value differently for men and for women. And since narcissism predicts higher partner count, it may actually, you know, you could argue that narcissism for men actually raises mate value, and for women, it lowers mate value. Certainly not something conclusive, but worth thinking about in any case. Next question here. Yep, well, part of the same question. So politics and social market value. So this was a question, I believe, about Emil Kierkegaard's research on political affiliation and mental health. I've read that. I occasionally read his things. So he found that people at the far left end of the spectrum had poorer mental health. And I believe that was actually based on self-ratings, self-reports of mental health and diagnoses from OkCupid, right? Because back in the day, I don't know if this is still the case, but back in the day on OkCupid, you would answer a lot of questions, and I guess they would collect that data. So, and they found, that's what he found, I suppose, is that relationship between far left politics and poor mental health. Interesting. I think he is actually doing some research at the moment as well on transgender individuals and intelligence. And I read his tweets and that sort of thing sometime. And he mentioned that they actually might have higher intelligence. And sometimes we see correlations between slightly higher intelligence and mental health issues as well. This varies a lot. And it's also kind of a stereotype. We tend to think of people who are very intelligent as being, autistic and that sort of thing. Correlations between intelligence and mental health are not very strong in most cases, but kind of that divergent thinking may be related to mental illness, and that may also explain why people who end up at perhaps that extreme end of political beliefs, that have very unconventional political beliefs, may also kind of co-vary with poor mental health. Something to think about. But more to the question and the current research at hand. What do politics tell us about social market value? Surprisingly, there's not a lot of research on this. It's something I've kind of gone into in the past. There's a few studies that indicate conservatives are rated as more attractive physically, right? Typically, the associations are not very high, although in this paper I've listed, they actually were kind of high. I think usually they're a little bit lower than this, but 0.3 for conservative ideology and physical attractiveness, and 0.5, so we're already looking at kind of a large correlation between physical attractiveness and conservative ideology here. A correlation of 0.5 means that about 25% will co-vary there, so fairly large. Are conservatives more physically attractive? They might be a little bit. Benevolent sexism, this is something I've looked into more recently. This is not a political measure specifically, except in the context that it's certainly something that is politicized, right? In the context of feminism, in the context of like the gender debates and that sort of thing. There's a concept, a scale that measures benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. And benevolent sexism, I'll explain what that is. If you think about a white knight, okay? If you've heard that expression, if you think about, or just a knight, if you think about the popular idea of chivalry, that women are good, but they're weak, and they need to be protected, and they need to be taken care of by a man, and they should be respected, and they should be cherished, because they're delicate and they're fragile. So there's sexist attitudes about women, but they're positive, okay? As the name would imply here, benevolent sexism. Probably much to the dismay of many feminists, benevolent sexism predicts better relationship outcomes. Okay, it predicts higher relationship satisfaction. It predicts higher life satisfaction for people in those relationships. It predicts higher sexual satisfaction. Not so for hostile sexism, right? Hostile sexism is negative sexist attitudes toward women. What would those be? Women are liars, women are manipulators, that sort of thing. Sexist attitudes toward women that are not positive. So why would benevolent sexism predict better relationship outcomes? A lot of this may actually overlap with belief in what are basically traditional gender roles. They may overlap with people who prefer traditional gender roles and, of course, assortatively select partners who prefer those, and they get along well in relationships. Some of these benevolent sexism measures, as I mentioned, things like women are good, basically. That's not an actual question, but it's certainly kind of the idea there, If you view women as more positive, certainly that could help your relationships with women. It's not inherently a negative measure, although certainly I think that was probably intended, especially by feminists and that sort of thing, that it's a sexist attitude and not a good thing. But the attitudes toward women, they're not hostile, they're not negative attitudes. We can also look at research on egalitarianism. I didn't list any studies here specifically, largely because the results here are kind of mixed. Some research on egalitarianism indicates that couples that are more egalitarianism, and this is often measured by egalitarianism behaviors like how do you organize or how do you split the chores up, have higher satisfaction, if it's relationship satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, that sort of thing. Some indicate no effect, some indicate the opposite effect. So we don't really see a consistent relationship between egalitarianism and relationship outcomes. As I mentioned, these aren't specifically political measures, but certainly attitudes toward egalitarianism, attitudes toward traditional gender roles. These are associated with the left or the right. They're certainly topics that are politicized if they are not inherently political, and perhaps to some extent they actually are inherently political. So overall, if I were to interpret the research on politics, does it raise your dating market value? Something to consider is that people select very assortatively for politics, okay? So if you are a conservative Trump fan and you're at Berkeley, you might find that that really impacts your dating life in a negative way because most of the people around you do not agree. Even if conservatives are more attractive on average physically or something like that, you may still find that your political beliefs don't help you in a dating environment. Similarly, if you are, a communist and you go and you live in a ranch in Wyoming, you may find that that impacts your dating chances at the country bar in a negative way. You may find that people in that environment don't like it. So if this helps or hurts your SMV, may be very, very contextual. It may depend a lot on the specific environment that you are in, because people do look for political traits and they will tell you, this is one of those things where people put it in their Tinder profiles and that sort of thing. If you are this, swipe left. So something to consider there. And that may actually be more practical than any of this other research on, if conservatives are more attractive, if benevolent sexism has better relationship outcomes. Because if someone says, you voted for the wrong guy and I don't want to date you, you're not even going to make it to that point where it matters if you are going to have, higher relationship satisfaction from being more or less benevolently sexist. So people select partners based on ideology, pretty heavy one. Something to consider there, perhaps the most important thing to consider as far as how politics might interact with your sexual market value. Another question here, life quality and long-term singledom. How does being single for a very long time impact your life? Is it positive or negative? I think most of the research certainly indicates that it is negative. If you ask people, particularly men, okay, if you ask men who are single, do you want to be single? Most will say no. About 90% of single men indicate that they do not want to be single by choice. Much higher for women, okay? And this is an area where research on men and women kind of produces different results. About 50% of women indicate being single by choice, and women who are single by choice actually score higher in measures of happiness and satisfaction than single men do. So, they kind of say women are the gatekeepers of sex. I would also argue, and I know this is probably controversial to people in the manosphere because some people have said otherwise, that women are the gatekeepers of relationships. Men approach women and women decide if you're going to enter, a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship or not. If most men want this, but single men, presumably they are chronically single because they are always consistently rejected, that's going to have a very different emotional and mental impact than it will on the women who are saying, I am single by choice, I'm going to reject all of the men who approach me. Because those single men not by choice, it's not like they're getting approached by women all the time and rejecting women. The dynamic back and forth between single men and single women is very, very different, even if we're looking at both of the ones that are not single by choice. There's a researcher, a Greek researcher. His name is Apostolou. I hope I'm saying that right. He does a lot of research on attractiveness, and he does a lot of research on singles as well. Recent study now, he found in involuntary singles in their 30s, they had lower self-esteem. So here, this is kind of a good answer to the question, I think, because we're looking at people who have remained involuntarily single into their 30s. He did not call them incels. He called them involuntary singles. He didn't measure, in this study at least, if they previously had sex. But these are people who are single, they don't want to be, and they have lower self-esteem. Confirmation of past research by the same researcher. Involuntary singles, they have more negative emotions in general, measured across different measures in that case. They additionally report lower life satisfaction. Some recent research, some of you may have heard of William Costello, very, very smart researcher, a young man who's going to be probably one of the best upcoming research on involuntary celibacy, I think, in coming in the future here. He conducted a study this year. Another young man named Brandon Sparks conducted a study, and Moscalino as well. So this year, 2020, has kind of been the year where we're seeing the first real empirical research on involuntary celibate men. Up to this point, there's been kind of qualitative research interpreting, what does inceldom mean, but there hasn't really been this kind of quantitative research. I've mentioned, I think, all of these studies and videos at the past, but something that we see across them is that incels, they have higher depression. They also have higher anxiety, and they have higher rates as well of autism spectrum disorders, which is not going to be something caused by inceldom, but certainly the depression could be. It could be both ways. It could be something that contributes to it and something that emerges from it, right? In any case, life satisfaction, what do we know? More anxious, more depressed. So kind of not a good thing there. One of the findings across these studies as well, that more likely to live at home, more likely to be neats. I think that kind of coincides with having poorer life satisfaction, living that lifestyle. This is something that we can probably theoretically make some assumptions about if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I have this up as well, where being single for a long time perhaps does not meet your needs on this period across multiple steps on this period. Your physiological needs, one of those, and this wasn't always the case in all of Maslow's models, but one of those at the very bottom, sex. Okay, so are you having regular sex if you are single? Probably not, but you could. Go up, and the next one, belongingness and love needs. That's where the relationships are. So you have your base needs met. Let's say you've made it past that, and you get up there, but then you're isolated, you're alone. You want a romantic relationship, but you can't find one. Are you going to meet those needs? Probably not. And I think this is a question that is probably one that can be answered in a very intuitive way. Because if you, like I just mentioned, you want a relationship, but you can't get one. Is that going to help your mental health in the long term? Probably not. Something we can also surmise from that. Imagine you are a man and you do not want a relationship. And maybe women don't like you anyway, or maybe they do. But whatever the case, you've decided you don't want a relationship. You've gone MGTOW, perhaps. You've decided that dating is not worth it, whatever the case may be. And you have reached a point where you're fine with that. You're cool with that. You don't have an urge to be in a relationship with a woman and all of that. Would that still impact your mental health in a negative way? That, I think, is something that we don't know, because all of this research up to this point has been on, involuntary singles. And that would be someone who is a voluntary single, right? That would be someone who may be more fulfilled or as fulfilled or, as someone in a relationship. There's research on that, as I mentioned, in women, right? In women who are voluntarily single. They tend to have good mental health outcomes. I haven't seen research, it may exist, but I haven't seen it on men who are voluntarily single. Much fewer men, as I mentioned, are voluntarily single. About 10% of single men claim to be versus 50% of single women who claim to be. So personally, I think it's certainly possible, that men who choose to be single could be just as fulfilled as, and certainly, as far as distributions go, variation in individuals, I would be surprised if there are not at least some men who are voluntarily single and super happy, and much happier that way than they would be in relationships. Certainly, I know men kind of like this. I think, you guys can see out in the internet, in the world, men who will tell you that they are that way. So the real question is, I think, about the men who are involuntarily single, right? The men who want a relationship and who can't achieve that. I think that's probably going to be where the frustration lies, perhaps even more so than just with the single condition by itself, right? As opposed to if we were to compare those men with men who are single by choice, who are confirmed bachelors, and who are happy living that way. The other question, moving on here, was about the replication crisis. I was asked, I talk about the replication crisis, kind of like nothing is being replicated. Can we talk about that a little bit more? So sure, a lot of replication crisis studies are not specifically related to dating or attraction. They're not specifically related to research in evolutionary psychology, which is actually a really small part of psychology, right? It's kind of a niche field. It might not seem that way because, it's kind of all we focus on here on this channel, but it is very small. And so I'm not even sure how many of these things have not been replicated well. The only one that I have really covered in depth, because I've written about this, would be dual mate hypothesis research, right? Also called ovulatory shift, or the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts. And what is that basically? Alpha fucks, beta bucks. The idea that women select for long-term relationships a provider, and for short-term relationships they select a good genes alpha male. The research that originally supported that hypothesis has not replicated well. I have an article about that up on the website. So as far as replication specifically related to topics that I talk about often, that's the only one that comes to mind. As far as replications in psychology in general and the replication crisis, we can go over some of the research here. The graph in the paper that I have up on the chart right now is from the first big replication test, which was in 2015. This is kind of what coined the term replication crisis and sparked this whole discourse. In blue, you can see the original studies, and in red, you can see the studies that failed to replicate, right? The ones that failed to replicate, I believe, should be actually over that line. So here we're seeing a great deal of research not replicating. Many of these findings, some of these studies are classic findings. Some of them are very niche findings that you probably wouldn't be that familiar with, or perhaps not even care about that much if it's not something that you already have a specific interest in. We'll go over what some of those are in a minute. Here's another one. This is a study from 2018 going over more recent psychology experiments. So it's not all just old stuff, okay? These are studies between 2010 and 2015. And the ones in yellow at the bottom, again, studies that couldn't replicate. They found about half of the studies they reviewed here did not replicate well. Klein, 2018. Here we can look at the original effects of the replication and where they came out after replication efforts, okay? If you look at, I should say, the triangle, if you can see this, I'm trying to see it right now on the screen. If you can look at the triangle here, that's the original effect size. The distribution should give you the new effect size. So a lot of these triangles are to the right of the zero, which means they found an effect. The distributions that are lined up with that line are the replications that found no effect. Basically, so just those ones at the top that are kind of pushed over to the side, those are the ones that did replicate well. And there's a few big ones here. One of the big ones that hasn't replicated well, not just in this, but even in more recent research, priming, okay? Priming is the idea that exposure to a stimulus right before some kind of event can precipitate a behavior. So an example of a priming study would be you put a gun in the room, sitting in the corner, and then you let people do one of those experiments where they can shock a participant. And so the gun's in the corner, and so they give more shocks to the other participant. That's a priming effect. And a lot of the research on priming has not been replicated. So priming may not even be a real thing. Some of the research on the familiarity effect has not replicated well. Familiarity, and this is actually related to dating and attraction. The idea that by being exposed to a face more and more often, you will become more attracted to that face. Now, I think the research that has been attempted to be replicated is not specifically related to faces, but rather is related to familiarity in marketing, right? Because that is where this effect is used in a practical sense. The idea that repeat exposure to something will make you view that thing more favorably, also called the repeat exposure effect. That's something that perhaps has not replicated very well lately. So some examples there. Many things are not replicating well. Many things at the same time are. So people have interpreted the replication crisis kind of as like a debunk of psychology. Like, oh, look at all these things that don't replicate. I mean, this is actually good. It's good that people are trying to replicate these things. It's good that we're finding out that some of them are not being replicated well so that we can kind of move on. That's how science works. You're not supposed to get it right all the time. And if you get it wrong, the method, science as a method, as you go forward, you should be able to go back and correct those things. So it's probably good that some of these things are not being replicated, unless you're, a researcher that kind of staked your career on them in an ideological sense. Maybe it's not good for you, but in general, it's kind of a good thing. There was a question about alcohol and IQ. And this question was specifically about, it was phrased in a causal way, right? Can drinking alcohol in moderation impact your IQ in a negative sense? So this is going to be something difficult to answer in a truly causal sense. And that's because you can't really assign people to experimental condition and have them drink alcohol in moderation. Almost all of the research is going to be observational. And a great deal of the research is going to be on binge drinking, which is what we see here. Okay, so people who binge, who drink a lot of alcohol, tend to have lower IQs on average. So really heavy use and binge use is associated with lower IQ in some studies, because there's some mixed results here as well. Really heavy use is associated with slightly lower IQ. More frequent drinking, or being more likely to drink on average, tends to be associated with a slightly higher IQ. So does alcohol lower the IQ, perhaps by damaging the brain? We can't know from this kind of research. All we can do is look at relationships. In this study, Gronkjer, I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. This one can be interpreted as a potentially or a quasi-causal methodology. They looked at IQ both before and after hospital diagnoses for alcohol-related disorders, right? So people who are drinking enough that they're getting put in the hospital and being diagnosed with some kind of alcohol problem. These guys have a decline in IQ, about 5 points. The mean was 100 in this research, declined down to 95 following this hospitalization. So are these guys drinking enough to damage the brain and actually lower their IQ? I mean, maybe. It's certainly consistent with that hypothesis, right? And as far as the effects of large amounts of alcohol on the brain, it would make sense. At the same time, they also had lower scores to begin with. So you still see the decline. They still drink too much. They go to the hospital. You retest them. They have lower IQ. But again, they were part of that cohort mentioned in the first study that are binge drinkers, heavy users who may actually have lower IQ as well. So if you have people who have low IQ, they're drinking a lot, they're damaging their brain, their IQ is dropping even more, not good. So what about moderate use? This is a very recent study, and this was a very big study, and it was in the mainstream media. It was publicized, and I think that's why it sticks in my mind. In the title of this paper, I didn't put it on the screen, but it was something like, "There is no safe quantity of alcohol." It basically is that I don't know if that's the exact title, but it was something very similar to that. And they found that even small use, even moderate use, was associated with a decline in gray matter in the brain. And it wasn't even a small decline, a decline in the volume of both gray and white matter. You can see the chart here. This is alcohol consumption over the week by grams. 100 grams here, so that's about 1 beer per day. So if you drink just 1 beer per day, that is still associated with a pretty large drop in the volume of the gray matter and the white matter in the brain. Is this a measure of IQ? It is not a measure of IQ. So does that decline in brain volume actually predict a decline in intelligence, or an estimate of intelligence like IQ? We can't know from that, but it is something to consider. As far as what the research shows, is that even very small amounts of alcohol consumption, even moderate consumption, is associated with changes in the brain. If those are meaningful changes, right, is up for debate, but they may very well be. Next question here. Now, we're kind of moving on to the opinions section here. So covering less research, but we're going to be going over some recent trends. One of the questions was about women increasing their standards. There was a sub-comment of that asked, can you go over the Psychology Today article? I've put the title of that up on the screen here, The Rise of Lonely Single Men. So this was a viral article, and I think this is related to the original question, which was, how does the recent increase in female standards basically how does that play out for men in the dating market? What's going to happen? So the rise of lonely single men. I don't know how many of you guys follow me on Twitter. This is actually something I wrote a long Twitter thread, and I covered a lot of research on this. And I'll try to summarize that up here as far as I can just remember on the fly. But I think it's possible that this is a crisis not of quantity, but of quality. A crisis of, and I'll explain what I mean by that, a crisis of perceived difficulty as well as actual outcomes. So I wrote an article, I think in the next slide, I'll put it up now, called How Have Relationships Changed in the Last 10 Years? And I looked at singles by age group and by gender since 2012, so the last 10 years, right when Tinder emerged, right before Tinder emerged, I believe, in 2012. So kind of trying to compare before and after online dating. Do we see more single men now? Do we see more singles in general? Do we see more single young men? And the answer seems to be no. Okay, recently, and I don't have this on the screen, but recently I went back and I looked at some old statistics from the US Census, and I compared them with new statistics as well. People got married much earlier in the 1950s, but if you look at the combined number of people that are cohabiting in stable relationships and married now, it's actually very similar to the 1950s as well. So what we are seeing is basically the same number of people in relationships. Okay, so I don't necessarily think that there is a dating crisis in a quantitative sense. We're not actually seeing more single men. We have seen recently, and I've written another article about that as well, that there are more sexless men, and that is actually about on par with sexless women at this point. That wasn't the case in a couple of years ago. There were more sexless men. Now sexless women have caught up, and this is mostly young people. So we're seeing young people having less sex, but we're not seeing fewer people at any age group actually in relationships. We are seeing fewer people getting married, but they're getting married later. It's not because they're staying perpetually single. So this is something to keep in mind when we talk about this dating crisis. It has been called the male dating crisis. Certainly there's a widespread perception right now, which the Psychology Today article was based on, that dating is getting very difficult for men. I think this is very much related to online dating and the perceptions from online dating, where about half of men can put a profile on Tinder and they'll get no matches, right? About half of profiles get 0 matches. And of those that get matches, a small sliver get most of the matches. So that can make it seem like dating is very, very difficult. Social media in general can give that perception. There's another question that has been hypothesis related to this, which has to do with evolutionary mismatch, right? The things that women find attractive in men now may not match up well with the current environment. So an example of this would be the priority for physical attractiveness and resources. Women right now maybe do not need resources as much as they would have at any point in human history. Not that long ago, choosing a man, if you were a woman, depended a lot on if he was able to provide resources. Right now, we see that more women are graduating college than men, right? We're seeing that the wage gap is closing if it has not already completely closed, right? There's certainly debate on that controversial topic. So women are making money for themselves, right? They don't need men to support them. That's going to change the reasons women pick men, right? At least hypothetically. There hasn't been a lot of research on this. I don't know if really there's been hardly any research at all on this. It is very, very new. But into the future, I think there will be, particularly if you guys follow William Costello is a researcher. I mentioned him previously. I think he will actually research this in the future. So keep an eye open for him. Does this make dating more difficult? It can certainly make dating more difficult. Even if we see the same amount of men entering relationships, men may need to put in much more effort to enter into relationships now than they did in the past. So dating could still be quantitative, or I should say, dating could still be qualitatively more difficult for men, even if we're seeing the same amount of men in relationships. So when I present the statistics and I say, we're not seeing more single men, okay, that doesn't mean that dating is not harder now. It could mean that. It could be consistent with that, but it's not proof of that. So that's something to consider, that men may need to be meeting a higher standard. One of the big things that I talk about sometimes is education. I just mentioned this. More women are graduating. There's a lot of talk about hypergamy. And actually, I'll talk about this a little bit later in a slide as well. If women prefer to select up, but women are making more or an equal amount of money as men, if they're graduating more, the pool of men to select up into is much smaller. They're going to have to select down, and that might make them less happy with their relationship choices. It might make them more picky as far as selecting men and that sort of thing. There's a lot of discussion on how Tinder and social media may impact women's choices. The idea that a woman can go on Tinder and have 100 matches and a bunch of men to select from, and that will influence the kind of man that she picks, that will make her more picky. I'm actually a little bit skeptical of this, and the reason is that women don't like most of their matches. It doesn't matter how many matches they get if they don't like most of them. So it's not like women have 100, a woman gets 100 matches. It's not like she has 100 desirable men to pick from. It would be very similar to if 100 men approached a woman on the street during the day, or if she sees 100 men on the street and they all approached, she's going to reject most of them. So just having the men available, I don't think it has the effect on female choice that is often kind of stated out there in the manosphere, right? That women's decisions are being inflated by their exposure to social media. I think there's other causes for that, basically what I just went over, but at the same time, I wouldn't discount it entirely. Certainly, it's not something that has been studied yet. It's not something that has been tested. So kind of just guesses at that point. Let's see, let's move on to the next question. What is the natural human mating pattern? So there are two in the research that people kind of go back and forth between: serial monogamy and polygamy, or specifically polygyny, which is a man having multiple wives. Much less frequently do we see a woman with multiple husbands. It occurs, but much, much more rarely. Serial monogamy means you form one pair bond, but it doesn't last for life, right? It lasts for years, it lasts for a period of time, and then they break up and they form a new monogamous relationship with a new person. This is what we see with most animals, most mammals, in fact. So some evidence for serial monogamy, okay, in humans. It's the most observed mating pattern right now. It's certainly the most observed mating pattern in recent human history as well. Additionally, most people express a preference for it. Most people don't engage in polygamous relationships. Even today, certainly people could if they wanted to. Most people aren't getting into poly relationships of any kind. So those are two pieces of strong evidence that would indicate this is kind of the natural human mating pattern, serial monogamy. And often I tend to lean towards saying that this is probably the natural pattern as well. Certainly it is the most frequently preferred pattern in that sense. Might be better to say than natural. For polygamy or polygyny specifically, okay, this is something we observe much more in hunter-gatherers, which may indicate that this was a more common mating pattern in early human history, or I should say in human prehistory, which could be an argument that this is the natural pattern for a man to have multiple wives. This would also be consistent with what we see as Y chromosome bottlenecks in genetic history. What does that mean? That's when we're talking about, something like only 30% of men have reproduced versus 80% of women. Part of this is probably explained by large groups of men being killed off, but at the same time, it's also explained by, one man having children by multiple women. That's the only way you get that kind of ratio. So we see a large amount of polygyny in the human genetic record, which may also mean that is a natural mating pattern. Of course, the two don't have to be exclusive, right? It's not necessarily like one is natural and one isn't. They're both very, very commonly seen in human beings, probably enough to say that they're both natural mating patterns, to be honest. Let's see, next question here. What dating advice do I think is wrong out there in the manosphere, out there in the dating world, so to speak? Okay, so first off, a big one that I talk about kind of frequently. Anything dark triad is probably wrong. I don't know why people started glorifying the dark triad. I think because, there has been research fairly consistently that shows that dark triad individuals, they tend to be rated as more attractive and they tend to have more sexual partners. Okay, so those two things have made it so that people have said, oh, dark triad, attractive, more sexual partners, got to do that if you want to be a pickup artist and that sort of thing. It makes sense. There's a lot of reasons why I think that this is still a very misguided strategy. One of those is that the dark triad is highly heritable, and as I mentioned previously, heritability up to 70%. Highly heritable personality traits, genetic, right? Trying to change your personality in many ways is going to be about as easy as like trying to change your height, guys. People talk about like change your personality, work on your personality. Something that researching personality has made me is kind of like a personality blackpiller, okay? It's much, much more difficult to change your personality than most people believe, than is popularly believed. There's research on interventions to change personality. It works very, very poorly, even with actual therapy, to change personality traits like the dark triad, like the big five. Interventions for personality disorders, like narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial, it doesn't work. These people stay like that their entire lives. Your personality is very, very stable, which also means that it's going to be very, very difficult to emulate. No one is going to become dark triad by trying to become dark triad. It's simply not going to happen. Perhaps you can emulate some behaviors and fool some women some of the time. I imagine it would be exhausting to try and keep that up for any extended period of time. Something else to consider about why this doesn't work very well is assortative mating, right? The kind of people who are going to be attracted to antisocial personality traits are themselves going to be antisocial. So the kind of people that you're going to be selecting for with that going to be problems. And if you look at people that have dark triad traits, their actual relationship outcomes are poor. Okay, they're very poor. So the question is, are you trying to have hookups with other dark triad people who kind of have personality issues? Or are you trying to have like a stable relationship? Because the way that you behave, your own personality will determine a lot of who you enter a relationship with and the kind of people that you attract. As these predict bad outcomes, probably not good traits to emulate there. Let's see, a second one here. Probably anything related to testosterone and dating. And I wrote an article recently about this called the testosterone blackpill, right? That testosterone, natural level testosterone in the human male, it's not very strongly associated with any personality variables. And additionally, most of the things, particularly lifting, things you can do to raise your testosterone level, it can only raise it incrementally, and that incremental increase is not closely associated with any of those outcomes as well, right? You're not moving it enough where you would actually change the knob, so to speak, on your personality. What does that mean as far as all of these testosterone things, where women are going to smell your high testosterone and doing this and that? Certainly, a lot of this is probably a grift, right? A lot of these people are trying to sell a program or a product or something like that. It's kind of a meme, the role of testosterone and all of that. If you have clinically low testosterone, by all means, that's a medical condition. Get that fixed, because that's bad for many, many reasons. But people, dating coaches and that sort of thing, telling you, to buy their supplement to boost your testosterone so that you will have better dating outcomes. There's no evidence for that. It's a grift. Let's see, what else? Dating advice is wrong. Okay, again, something I've written about. Anything related to the dual mate hypothesis, right? Which is basically the entire framing of alphas and betas. What we've seen is that research supporting this hypothesis has not replicated well. David Buss formulated more recently the mate switching hypothesis, and he wrote a paper on this. I've actually reviewed that in another video. Most of the traits that women prefer in short-term mates are also traits that women prefer in long-term mates. Okay, when women have short-term matings, it's kind of an evaluation of that person as a potential long-term partner. Or in other words, what women are selecting for in short-term mates is also what they desire in long-term partners. So physically, behaviorally, as far as being a resource provider or having good genes or all of that, it's, you know, if women are picking you as a short-term partner, they probably would date you long-term as well. The whole framing of alphas and betas and, you know, that sort of thing, probably not helpful, not really supported by the research. Another one, again, something else I wrote, I put the title of the article here on the slide is AWOLT, right? All women are like that. I think this is bad dating advice. I think it's typically unhelpful in many ways. So first off, most personality correlations between sex and the variable and the personality measure are very, very low. So anytime you try to make a judgment about an individual based on those correlations, you will actually be wrong most of the time. And when I say most, I mean you would be wrong more than if you just guessed based on chance anytime the correlation is lower than 0.5. This is something discussed in the statistics in this article. So when we do statistics on personality, when we research personality, everything that we talk about is a group mean, right? We're comparing the means of two groups. So when we say, for example, that men are less agreeable than women, and I wish I had the graph of this that I could put up, but I'll explain it. When we say that men are less agreeable than women, we're talking about on average. But if you view the distribution of men and women who score in trait agreeableness, something like 90% of that actually overlaps. So most men are actually as agreeable as most women, even though men on average are less agreeable. So if you took research like this and you tried to apply it to AWOLT, and you said, oh yeah, I'm going to assume most women are more agreeable, and you use that to inform your decisions with individual women, you will be wrong most of the time. Additionally, a lot of the kind of female nature discourse, things that people claim is female nature, a lot of that circling around and put into that context is just made up. You know, it was never correct to begin with. I won't give specific examples of that. I'm just going to say a lot of that is made up. So if you're applying these low correlations and things that are not real to AWOLT, that's going to misinform your behavior with individuals very, very, very often. And that's a big limitation of a lot of the research I cover here, a lot of the statistics. I think intuitively, we like to read these studies and think about like, these studies can help us in our own dating life, right? These studies can help us make decisions about our interactions. Much of the statistics we cover here, unfortunately, really, really can't, because you can't generalize from means to individuals, right? That's called, in statistics, it's called the ecological fallacy, because individuals can fall anywhere. And knowing the mean of a distribution does not actually mean that you even know the likelihood that an individual will be close to that mean. So AWOLT gives people rules that are very, very rigid, often incorrect. And people go into interactions with individual women trying to apply those, and it's kind of very forced, it's misleading, it probably misinforms them about what the other person is like, it creates expectations about the other person. Some of those AWOLT things are basically negative opinions, right? They're things like you should be skeptical of women and things, and that's probably not very helpful in your dating life and interactions either. So those are 4 things that I think are probably very common and probably unhelpful in dating advice. Let's see. So what is helpful in dating advice? I was asked, what's some research-based dating advice? So number 1, I put on here is lift, get jacked, okay? This is something that is actually surprisingly consistent, and it's probably underestimated even the effect, because the effect sizes for muscularity and bodily attractiveness are actually pretty high. You know, we're looking at like 0.8, 0.9. So as far as psychology goes and the kind of effect sizes we see, this is actually really high. It's actually higher than a lot of personality variables. So being physically fit, from the neck down, surprisingly important, you know, and people talk a lot about facial attractiveness and gym cells and that sort of thing. Most people, I think even people that are talking about within dating the importance of lifting and being physically fit are probably even underestimating the effect of that. It's probably even a more important effect than people who endorse it tend to know. So, and also, why is this good dating advice? Well, aside from being research-based, it's actually something that you have some limited ability to improve. You know, a lot of things you can't change. Your height is pretty stable. You're not going to do a lot to change your height. And of course, your genetics bound your ability to get jacked. Your genetics probably even bound your ability to self-motivate and get in the gym at all, to moderate your diet. So there's a lot going on there where it's not as easy as, you know, fitness YouTube might make you believe, like, hey, get disciplined and get in the gym. But at the same time, it is a variable that changes based on environmental contributions in a large way. Something you can do. Okay. Second here, and kind of mentioned in the past research on the male dating crisis. Number 2, I put stay in school, get as high a degree as you can. We talk a lot about hypergamy, and people have actually come to kind of misuse this term often. I see people using hypergamy as a synonym for promiscuity often. It's not the same thing. Hypergamy is used almost always in the literature to describe women selecting up in status. Okay, so usually that's defined by education or by income level. Right now in the West, we're beginning to see educational hypogamy. What does that mean? Women selecting down, as they must, because more women are going to school and more men aren't. But women show a preference for hypergamy, right? Women want men who are higher in status than they are. Women want men who have higher incomes. And the best way to signal that in Western culture is to get a degree. There's a lot of discourse around useless degrees, especially in the United States, where there's a lot of debt associated with degrees. You know, you get a useless degree, you're going to be stuck in debt. Whatever the case may be, having an education is still one of the most robust signals of status in Western culture. If you don't have a degree, even if you have a good income, you're dating women who are highly educated, they're probably going to look down on you. You know, you're not going to fit that requirement of hypergamy. If you're a poor professor, you know, you got a PhD, you're still in a high status position, even if you don't make a lot of money. That's just simply the way that it is seen. And again, you know, this is something that research-based, and aside from that, it's, again, I think good dating advice because it's something, again, that is malleable, unlike, you know, height. You can fixate on height or something like that. You can't change it. It's very, very stable. You kind of can go to school and get a degree. So it's something else that you can do. Number 3 here, I put pro-social behavior. This is something rarely discussed in dating, pickup artistry, and all of that. But there's a lot of research on pro-social behavior. I post about this actually very often on Twitter. I post a lot of research on Twitter every day. If you guys aren't following me there, and you are on Twitter, follow me on Twitter. I talk about this very, very often. There's a great deal of research, specifically within evolutionary psychology that talks about the role of pro-social behavior. A lot of research on this and its relationship with attractiveness. Very, very consistently predicts attractiveness. Vastly overlooked in the dating community online. Why? I think partly one of the reasons is because it's considered a honest signal or a true signal. And what does that mean? That phrase means that it's something that's difficult to fake. An example of pro-social behavior is your ability to provide resources, right? Difficult to fake. Difficult to fake good behavior, helping other people, or altruism over the long term. In the short term, perhaps. In the long term, no. Some people confuse pro-social behavior with being a nice guy, right? It's not being a nice guy. Pro-social behavior is providing benefits to those around you, and not just material benefits, but not behaving in an antisocial way, not being dangerous, not harming the people around you, and that sort of thing. So without going into a lot of detail on that, because certainly that is a topic that can be explored in great, great depth. Pro-social behavior, trait agreeableness, right? Trait openness. Those are two things that are viewed very, very positively for men. And I said not being a nice guy, but there's a lot of research as well on kindness, right? Kindness as an individual variable measured in part by trait agreeableness, in part measured by other scales, predicts attractiveness very, very strongly, much, much more strongly than most people think. Women will tell you, be kind, and it sounds kind of like superficial advice, like, oh, be a nice guy. You know, it sounds kind of blue-pilled, but if you look at actual research on what people find attractive, kindness is actually very, very important. So let me do a fourth one, actually, that just occurred to me, not on the slide. I'm going to say grow a beard, and that's very, very specific, and I'll tell you why. So I recently wrote an article, the most recent article on the website, all about facial attractiveness, and I was very surprised when I was reviewing, you know, I did a review of something like 50 papers, how much of the research on facial hair indicated that women have a preference for facial hair over clean-shaven faces. It could be a full beard, a stubble, heavy stubble, light stubble. In almost all of the papers that I read, women indicated a preference for facial hair over a clean-shaven face. It didn't matter if the face was more masculine or less masculine. In both cases, the preference still persisted. The only exception was if the facial hair was kind of like patchy, right? So if it's like patchy, scrubby kind of facial hair, no. But in any other condition, yes. So again, something very, very specific that you can do that will probably improve your facial attraction. And these were actually relatively large effect sizes. The same faces with facial hair were rated about 1 point higher on a 5 to 7 point Likert scale, right? So you can, so on a 10-point scale, you know, growing some stubble or a beard could raise your facial attractiveness by 2 points. Imagine. That's a lot. I think probably that is underestimated as well. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, I think we're getting close to the end here. So, opinions on the red pill and the black pill. Okay, something I have said often. I think there's a core nucleus of truth in the red pill and the black pill. And what that is in both cases, in the sense of the red pill, status matters. Okay, there's a lot of research indicating status matters. As far as the black pill is concerned, looks matter. That's the core nucleus of truth there. In fact, looks probably matter more than status. I've certainly talked about looks perhaps more often than anything on this channel. Looks may be the most important variable for initial relationship success, I should say, relationship initiation at the very beginning. How important they are for long-term relationship outcomes is another question, but as far as getting through that gate and actually getting dates, probably looks are the top variable. So, what else? Heritability or genes, they limit what you can change. This is where the black pill gets it more right than the red pill, right? Because the red pill is very much about changing personality. Something I said earlier in this video, I'm kind of a personality black pillar in a way. I think your personality is very, very stable. You know, this is what the research tend to shows. Probably not going to change it very easily. So certainly looks as well. Your genes, the heritability of these traits limits what you can change by a very great deal. The black pill kind of gets that right. What the black pill, I think, often does not get right, or what it does not quantify in a way, is how much something matters. It never tells you specific, you know, I don't say it, you know, it's certainly not a single thing, but it's rare that people will talk about how much a specific variable impacts something. It's rarely quantified, it's rarely described in a lot of detail, so that's kind of a limitation there. It can very often be exaggerated, but whatever. The core nucleus of truth there, these things are very important, they matter. What else they get wrong in this case is they underestimate the role of personality and behavior. What we see often in black pill communities is basically looks only matter. People say looks are personality and that sort of thing. This is not something really supported by the research. We see in many cases that behavior does contribute about as much as looks to many different variables, depending on what we're looking at, depending on what is being measured. At the same time, as I mentioned, this is something that is also genetic. So, you know, can you just fix your personality, bro? Probably not as easy as the people who would tell you that personality matters, you know, say that it is, but it does matter. Behavior matters. It matters a lot. Let's see. Something about them as well that I don't like. Okay, they're very ideological. They miss a lot of nuance. Okay, it's just, what more can be said about that? Highly ideological. A lot of the time they miss a lot of nuance. They have these core things that they get right. Do they present those in a nuanced way with magnitude, in detail? Very often not. Okay, another one, sometimes they just make things up. Yeah, very common. Not much more can be said about that. There's a very heavy reliance on anecdotes. This is something I really don't like in a lot of these communities. So many men, I suppose, especially in kind of black pill and incel communities, I think they don't have a lot of experience with relationships and social situations. And so they rely a lot on anecdotes. And these anecdotes will take the form of like TikTok videos of what they've read on Reddit forums. I see this very, very often. This reliance on anecdotes is not going to substitute for experience. But even if it were experience, then it would not be very generalizable, right? You have to take samples. You have to actually research things if you want to generalize behavior, because a lot of the time our experiences don't generalize to behavior very well. And that's kind of a thing. You can say everyone I know does X, everyone I know does Z. And it's a biased selection. It might be that everyone you know is not representative of how people in general behave. So this really heavy reliance on anecdotes in these communities, something I kind of dislike about them. Let's see what else here. Okay, I'm not going to say this is true about everyone in the red pill or black pill, but there's a subset of men in these groups that they simply dislike women. Okay, and that's their thing. They are attracted to these ideologies because they don't like women, and they want to point out ways that women are bad and wrong and that sort of thing. And it is what it is, There's a subset of these as well that are just grifts. They're just trying to market a book or a program or whatever. And here's the thing, you write a book, okay, cool. You have a good product to sell or a service, that's fine. I'm not like opposed to that, but certainly there is a great deal of ideology that is trying to get people riled up, and it's trying to sell a bunch of things, okay? So you got to see that for what it is. There's a subset of red and black pill that is basically nothing more than gender politics. This kind of goes with the previous point that some are just men that dislike women. There's a subset of this. It's just gender politics. It's very much all about, men versus women. Men good, women bad. This is why women suck, and so forth. Certainly that's not something that I'm especially interested in. I have seen an alternative, or I guess phrase used occasionally, the white pill. And the way that I have seen this phrase is finding some point of peace and acceptance with your situation, whatever that may be. If you want to date, but dating is hard, or you can't date and you want to, or you're MGTOW and you've decided you don't want to date and you don't want anything to do with women, whatever the case may be, if you're able to find some point of peace and acceptance with that and not get riled up online, don't let your blood pressure raise. You are cool with whatever your situation in life is. You're not getting stressed out. You're not hating other people over it. It's probably the best place to be from a mental health perspective. I think, this is a goal kind of that if people can transition into that mindset would be very helpful, regardless of how closely you align with red pill or black pill, as long as, you're not watching videos online and your heart is racing and you're getting like really stressed out and anxious because they're making you angry, which, I mentioned, there's a subset that is gender politics. This is something we see in kind of elderly people that watch a lot of news, a lot of political news. It doesn't really matter if they're like left or right wing. They just watch politics all the time and they just stay angry all the time. Many of you, perhaps you know someone like that who just stays in a perpetually aroused, angry state because they just feed their brain with politics nonstop. I see people that do that with these kind of red and black pill ideologies. Certainly not everyone. I'm certainly not talking about everyone, but some people, I think that's probably not very helpful, probably not a good place to be in. So different opinions on the red and the black pill there, what I think they get right and what I think is less helpful. And that is the end of the questions. We'll do another question series pretty soon, I hope. Next plan for a video, I'm going to make a summary of the recent article that I wrote. So I conducted a short survey of the face of the Giga Chad, and I asked men and women, do you find Giga Chad attractive or not? I would recommend going to the website. You can see the results of that, and you can see a literature review as well on facial attractiveness, on facial sexual dimorphism, what facial features women find attractive and how much do they agree. If you don't want to read it because it's very long, that will be the next video in any case. So very soon, I hope. Great video as always. Very good talking to you guys. Make sure to subscribe, like, and I'll talk to you guys again very soon.